What's good, folks? Family, friends, loved ones, enemies, frenemies, wizards, witches, muggles, mudbloods, people of Middle Earth to another episode of Disguised Coverage, the only podcast in existence that gives you an equal amount of blueberries in each muffin. I'm your host, Anthony Prohaska. Find me on Twitter at pro_. Give me a follow on the old Twitter machine. In tonight's episode, we're going to dive into, you guessed it, strengths and weaknesses of the 2023 NFL draft class with relation to the Buffalo Bills. This is a conversation that I think has to happen every year and stems a little bit from last week's episode with Joe Marino, where we talked about talent cliffs and knowing the talent pool in the draft class and knowing where the value is across the draft as a whole. But really, when you start to stack up position groups versus position groups, you've got your obvious tiers within each position group, but how does position A stack up versus position B versus position C? Where do you get the best value given your needs? Is it in round one? Can you wait until 2 or 3 or 4? Which position groups are top heavy? Which position groups have more depth? Which position groups are great rounds 1 through 4? Which position groups aren't as strong at the top? So on and so forth. That's where this episode is going to go tonight. I got distracted by this comment. John says, my wife doesn't watch the show, but she loves the intro. That's awesome. I appreciate you, John, and your wife. That's fantastic. Very, good news here from Jim. Jim says it's been a good day. My son got to personal beat or busted his track meet. Now I get to listen to the Bills podcast on my way home. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. On John says as the tree, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate you. Oh, good comment here from Mark saying, looking forward to real football discussions instead of delusional Dolphin fans talking about what they think is a Dolphin Super Bowl team who hasn't won a playoff game in 23 years. Oof. Shots fired. Oh, I see some comments here from Dennis. We're going to get to those in a bit in this intro. Pop says, LA Chargers tree. Oh, I kind of like where your head's at. A little powder blue and yellow action. A little bit of a Chargers feel. Just an Easter tree. I'm just all about the pastel garlands come Easter time. And it just happened to have pastel blue and yellow. Could be a pastel green or a pink, but a little Charger action. I appreciate you recognizing the tree and throwing it out there a little bit. So I get distracted by the good comments all the time. It's tough, but I appreciate you folks for being here. If you are here live on this episode, or if you're watching later and you're not watching live, whatever have you, please drop a like on this video. I put it in the comments to start. I know that's corny, but likes go a sincerely long way towards helping myself and the entire team to track and trend in front of more eyes and ears. It affects the algorithm and boosts us forward. So please, and thank you. Drop a like on this video. What I want to mention, as you folks should know at this point when we go through episodes of Disguised Coverage here, as we start to move through different position groups. For those of you joining me live, I want to know your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, theorems, ideologies, maxims, beliefs. What do you think of this position group that we're talking about? What do you think of a specific player in it? Who do you have your eye on? What do you think the best value is? So on and so forth. Really want to go through all of that and see where your folks, where your heads are at in terms of, position groups, the draft class as a whole, specific players as we go through. Oh, John nailed it. John says, love the highly informed chat. I really enjoy the highly informed chat too. I like the back and forth you folks have with one another, the back and forth with myself. It's a good time. Oh, Sophia says, hi, Aunt, 2 weeks and 2 days. Yes, that's right. The NFL draft, it's wild. I still feel like the Bills just lost to the Bengals. And then I was getting ready for the Senior Bowl in February. And lo and behold, we are right now from Tuesday, April 11th. We are 2 weeks and 2 days from the NFL draft. And before you know it, it'll be rookie minicamp. Before you know it, it'll be training camp and preseason football. And then the NFL season will start. It's wild how fast the years go by and the seasons move by. And I really feel like the Bills season just ended. And it was like, oh, I can't wait until the draft. It's going to be so long. And I feel like I blinked and here we are. So yeah, she's right. 2 weeks and 2 days. Oh, really nice comment from Mark. Mark says the quality of your content and depth of football knowledge is very much appreciated. Your comment is very much appreciated, Mark. Thank you very much. Joe DeRosa says, gee, this guy Ant sure is a pro. Get out. You're done. If I had like a ban button, I would use it for you. Technically I do, but I know who you are, so I won't. But I appreciate your sense of humor. Wanted to grab this comment from Dennis, who says, trade a round 2 pick for Devin White. I like Devin White as a player, linebacker from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If you didn't see the news today, he requested a trade from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Contract stuff isn't working out. He's under that 5th-year option, wants some more money. He's played well. He's Super Bowl champion. He and Levante David have been key cogs in that Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, and he's a really good linebacker. But I don't think the scheme fit is ideal in the Bills defense. I think he's more of a Will than he is a Mike. He's really good coming forward. He's a good blitzer. He's good in man coverage. I don't think he necessarily fits the need the Bills currently have at their linebacker spot, given the previous roles that they've had. Now, again, this is something I'll say throughout this entire episode, especially when we talk about linebackers, and something that I've said these last several episodes and talking about this Bills offseason and the Bills defense. Maybe the Bills defense moves in a different direction with Sean McDermott being the full-time and legitimate caller and designer of the defense now that Leslie Frazier is gone. Myself and Eric Turner did a film room a couple of weeks ago on what the Bills defense could potentially look like based on what we studied from Sean McDermott's defense in Carolina. We showed a bunch of clips breaking down his aggressiveness, his fronts, his blitz packages, what he likes to do. So if the Bills go in a bit more of that direction, maybe you see somewhat of a scheme change or a role change at the linebacker spot. But as of right now, I don't think Devin White is a scheme fit. Then there's also the cost. His contract is decently large. And if you're, and then also too, are you going to go long-term with him? And if that was the case, when you've just signed Tremaine Edmonds, like he would have already been a better fit. I think there's some logistical questions, both on the field and monetarily from a contract standpoint. Talent though, Devin White's a terrific linebacker. I don't know if the fit is necessarily the right piece, but I like where your head's at because they do need to upgrade that linebacker spot. And that's something we're going to talk about in this episode. Appreciate you, John. John says he loved that film room of the Carolina clips. Yeah, it was important. I think to really fully understand where this Bills defense could be going, I think you have to see what Sean McDermott's defenses looked like in the past. And his tenure as the defensive coordinator for Carolina was very successful. That team went to a Super Bowl. They honestly could have won that Super Bowl if not for the fact that Denver's defense on the other side, led by Von Miller, just had an unreal game for themselves and turning Carolina over and over. And the Panthers kind of not capitalizing when they could have offensively. But McDermott was a good DC in Carolina. And I think understanding his coaching style as a DC and understanding where he came from, that Jim Johnson tree in Philadelphia, again, it could potentially shine some light on what this Bills defense could look like under Sean McDermott. I know there's like rumblings still with people saying, McDermott's been the DC here or has been the coach here this entire time, and the defense has been blah, blah, blah under Leslie Frazier, so nothing's probably going to change. It was always McDermott's defense. I don't think that's necessarily true. I get the notion of that, but I think understanding what Sean McDermott was as a defensive coordinator and what his defenses looked like is very important going into this upcoming season. So I'm glad you like that film room. And I think it really set the table for a lot of these conversations that we're having in the Cover One film room here on Disguised Coverage and throughout this entire offseason. And we'll probably have those conversations further based on what happens in the draft, because I think how the Bills address the linebacker position in the draft, I don't think this is a very surprising thing I'm about to say, but I think the way the Bills address the linebacker position in the draft will really narrow that scope and focus in terms of what the Bills defense is going to be schematically, because that linebacker position is so integral to everything they do defensively, not just from a front perspective, but in relation to their light boxes, the overall count, the nickel defense, the coverages they play on the back end. So it's going to be very interesting, very interesting. Ooh, RJ comes in and says, I think Campbell, Sanders, and Simpson could all be better than Devin White at middle linebacker in this system. Interesting thought. Maybe that's something that we will touch on. Oh, I like the comment here from Ron. Ron says the trade down would be great. I really would like a trade down, mainly because, and this will tie into one of the points, but I think with what the Bills need and want and how the board's going to fall, I really do think linebacker is the best option early, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit and why. But I think a trade back would be ideal. The only problem with that is it's always risky. How do you know? Oh, and John says right here, I think the Steelers would take Campbell at 32. I was going to say, how do you know you don't trade down to 33? And the guy you thought that was going to be there at 33, somebody jumps you at 32 or 31. It's always tricky. In an ideal world, though, Ron, yes, the Bills would be able to trade down, still acquire the player that they had initially intended to, or one of the several players. You're not going to trade down unless there's several guys that you've got tabbed. And so you're like, okay, one of these guys is going to be there if we trade back 5, 6, 7, 10 picks or whatever. So let's do that if you got that handful or that cluster. But I really feel like they're going to go linebacker early, but we're going to talk about that as we go forward. Now, again, the whole theme of this episode, strengths and weaknesses of the 2023 NFL draft for the Buffalo Bills. I think it's important to discuss the talent pools, the tiers, and the class as a whole, but also position by position, how they stack up with one another, because it informs us in terms of what's going to happen, and it really sets the tone for how every single team operates. And like I mentioned, this ties into something that Joe Marino said last week when he was here on the show. As we talked about last week with him, he mentioned, how talent cliffs and the talent pool impacts draft boards. And if we're just going off of just a made up example, player A at this position might be, or is obviously better than player H, right? You've got player A at this position and he's better than player H, but maybe there's less drop off from player A to player H at this position than there is from player A to player H at another position. And you have to do that cost benefit analysis with every pick that you make as you attempt to upgrade multiple positions or roles with every pick. You have to take that into account as you attempt to upgrade, again, those multiple roles or positions with every pick. And the Bills roster is a good roster. I know it's a bit doom and gloom after that loss to Cincinnati, and it's a conversation of can they get over the hump and how do they stack up against the Chiefs and the Bengals, and the AFC East got better with what Miami did, and if the Jets get Aaron Rodgers, in theory, they've gotten better, and so on and so forth. The Bills roster is a good roster, but they do have a multitude of positions where they could use an upgrade. And to upgrade a multitude of positions in the NFL draft any year requires a balancing act of the draft board. And that balancing act starts with knowing the talent pool overall in the draft, knowing the player tiers within each position group, knowing where the value lies in each position group, and knowing how each position group stacks up versus one another. And that's where tonight's episode comes in. We're going to look at the 2023 NFL draft class through the lens of knowing its strengths and weaknesses in order to formulate the best value for the Bills to upgrade their roster in a multitude of ways. And as I mentioned earlier, questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, beliefs, theorems, ideologies, maxims, anything and everything, please drop them into the chat as we go forward with each position grouping. I'm going to bring them up on the bottom. We're going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about players, the group as a whole, so on and so forth. I want to know your folks' thoughts with each group. I like the engagement here on the show. As you always know, I'll pull up as many comments as I physically and possibly can. Super chats get priority. 1, because I respect the monetary donation. 2, the color takes me away from my notes, and I see it and bring it up immediately. But it brings some comments before we dive fully into it. Pete says player A having a similar impact to player H and is explaining why Bijan isn't worth a top pick. So that's a fair conversational point to have, right? I think Bijan Robinson is one of the best players in this entire draft. And I don't have a problem with the Bills taking him at 27, provided some other things happen. Depending on who's on the board, I might not love it, but he's tremendous, and I legitimately think he would help the Bills' offense and help the offensive line as well. But even if you just take that example, right, I don't think there's definitely a gap between him and Jahmyr Gibbs from Alabama, who's my RB2. But Jahmyr Gibbs is fantastic. And if not for Bijan Robinson, Gibbs would be the clear-cut RB1 in this class. And then you've got other guys who still offer benefits like Charbonnet, and I like Devin Achane. And then all the way down like late, like I like Muhammad Ibrahim from Minnesota. And you got guys like Tajay Spears mixed in. And there's a lot of value in the running back class, which we're going to talk about towards the back end of this episode. But that's also the conversational point too. Like if you take Bijan Robinson, is he amazing? Yes. But what's the drop off from RB1 to RB2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in this class versus the drop off from wide receiver 1 to wide receiver 6 or 7, offensive tackle 1 to offensive tackle 6 or 7, so on and so forth. Not that the Bills are going to get offensive tackle 1 there at 27, but that's that conversation, right? That's that cost benefit analysis, because every person you take means, again, this isn't shocking or revelatory information. Every player that you take means you passed on a multitude of others. And it's all about that balancing act, trying to get the best value at every single position. If you take an A at this player here, does that mean one of your other positional needs, can you still get an A later? Can you get a B later? Can you get a C? Oh, probably not. So then maybe you should take an A at one of those other positions now, because that other position that you were going to take an A at, you can still get a B later, and you can play that game and you can balance. It's all about getting as many positional upgrades as possible across the entire roster. And that's that cost benefit, analysis. I do like Bijan Robinson though. And I don't care about logic when it comes to him at some point. And as Pete says here, Bijan is easier to hit on, but won't have the impact hitting on other positions would. Oh, that's a whole nother conversation, because he's really good, and it depends on how you use him, what happens, so on and so forth. I think he would have a large impact on the offense. Now it's debatable, would he have a better impact than going offensive tackle in round 1 or wide receiver in round 1? For me, I think he would have a bigger impact than wide receiver, given who I think will be there at 27. Offensive tackle, I think, is a different conversation. And maybe even linebacker, even though I think Bijan is much, much, much higher on my board than any of the linebackers in this class. We really should just do a whole pod on Bijan Robinson, because I feel like he's so polarizing and he creates so much conversation. Ooh, Elizabeth coming in saying, I'll be bummed if we don't invest in the trenches at all in the first couple rounds. I'm with you to a degree there. Ron says the same thing. Me too, Elizabeth. All right. Now, we're going to dive right into it. First one, we're going to talk about wide receiver. So the 2023 NFL draft strengths and weaknesses. We're going to start with the wide receiver position. So as I mentioned before, with wide receiver being here, questions, thoughts, comments, concern, players you like, players you don't, who are you watching, how, why, all that kind of stuff. Throw it up into the chat as we go forward here. We're going to start with the wide receiver position, in part because there's been some buzz around the Bills and and potentially picking a wide receiver recently. That's also part of why I put Jackson Smith-Njigba on the graphic here. I know he's a Bills Mafia darling, so that kind of influenced me a little bit here. Oh, I'm going to grab this quick question here statement here from Joe. He says, I just don't think using your most valued pick on a back who would be going to an offense that doesn't really have a feature back would be ideal. But how do you know Bijan isn't going to be the feature back if he's there? Like, if he's that much better, maybe he does get 80% of the carries. And what we've seen from the Bills down the stretch the past several years, they've started to lean into more of a feature back role, especially 2 seasons ago. They rode Devin Singletary. He got, I think, 100% of the snaps in the wild card round and the divisional round against Kansas City, in addition to having, I think, a 90% snap share in the regular season down the stretch the last 4, 5, 6 weeks. I think the Bills would, again, how much does anyone use a feature back nowadays, quote unquote? It's going to vary by team, but I think if the Bills got someone like Bijan, I think you would see him get the significant lion's share of carries. Now, I think one of my negatives would be, well, did you just waste a second round pick on James Cook last year? I think Bijan's awesome, but now what does that mean for James Cook? So on and so forth, all these conversations. Bijan is he's a conversation starter for sure, but I'll stick to the wide receivers now here. So wide receivers. Ooh, I love Pops Mafia is here every week. And 1, I appreciate the hell out of you for it. 2, Pops loves Trey Palmer from Nebraska. He comments on him every week almost. Anytime we're talking draft, and Pops already says Trey Palmer in the 3rd round would be a great addition. He can fly. I think he's got value in the 3rd and 4th round just because of how fast he is and how much he can fly. There are some things I don't like about him from a route running standpoint, a physicality and frame standpoint, but dude can fly in every which way, shape, and form. So I understand why you like him so much. So he is a wide receiver. We're going to start with wide receivers. Now, for me, I talked about it this offseason. I mentioned it last week. This entire wide receiver group has questions in it. I think the wide receiver group as a whole is an enigma. For me, it all starts with, again, this is something I've stated on multiple shows here, the redundancy in the wide receiver group here in the NFL draft for this year for 2023, the redundancy in terms of size and frame and skill set. You got a lot of slot guys. You got a lot of potentially Z wide receiver guys, not a lot of true X's. You don't have a lot of guys really over 6 foot. You don't have a lot of guys even over like 185, 190 pounds or anybody approaching 2. A lot of these guys are like 5'7, 5'8, 5'9, 175 to maybe 185 pounds. Like you, shorter arms, smaller catch radiuses, which is part of the reason why guys like A.T. Perry and Cedric Tillman and Jonathan Mingo, these guys who have more of the prototypical wide receiver frames, guys who were, 6 feet or above and 200, 205, 210, or in Mingo's case, 220 pounds plus, those guys are getting more talk as we get closer to the draft and more love because they represent a frame and skill set that isn't really popular, or not popular, that isn't necessarily populated or overly populated in this draft class. And a piece I want to mention as well, so Roy comes in and says JSN is absolutely a first rounder. I agree. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he's on the graphic for this episode. I really like his game. He is my wide. I go back and forth between him and Addison as my wide receiver one. We'll start with Jackson Smith-Njigba. He really is, I don't want to say he's a slot only, but because he's really best in the slot and that's where he projects, that's why I go back and forth in terms of like where to rank him, because it's going to impact how teams view him and where teams are going to want to take him. And granted, majority teams are heavy 11 personnel now anyways, but like, what are you expecting from your slot role? Like, what are you looking for? Do you need a slot receiver? Do you need more of a true X or a Z, and does he fit that? What does the skill set look like for that? But for me, Jackson Smith-Njigba is the only true wide receiver in this class for me that has a true first round grade, not like, first, second, or like, he could go at the end of the first, but I really have a second round grade on him. Jackson Smith-Njigba has a true first round grade for me. That's why he's on the graphic. I really like his game. I think he would ideally, in this Bills defense, he would fit in this Bills offense, he would fit beautifully into the offense, given his skill set and what he did when he was at Ohio State. You've got somebody who has such a good feel for leveraging space, for finding openings, reading the defense. He's not the most athletic. He's more smooth than he is quick or sudden, but really good body control. He's athletic. He's fluid in how he moves. He's fluid even just how he transitions from receiver to ball carrier. He's also a willing blocker. Again, not the sharpest, not the most sudden mover. He's not somebody I think that is just going to, shake you out of your shoes in the middle of the stem, but he separates because he has the ability to work in different combinations in his route stems, in his breaks. He can separate at the catch point. He can separate at the stem, separate at the top of the route. My big thing with him, though, is, and this is part of the reason, too, why he's on this graphic, I don't think Jackson Smith-Njigba is there at 27. Even though he is best in the slot, or if you're saying he is slot only, so on and so forth, I do think he goes before 27. Now, how far he drops in the first round, potentially, that's a conversation starter, because I don't know, do you want to trade up for Jackson Smith-Njigba? I personally don't. I don't want to, depends on how much you have to give up, I think, in any conversation. But I don't know if he's creeping down there and it's 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Do you try to trade up for him? He's a tremendous player given his skill set and the role that he would fit on this Bills team. He would be a tremendous plug and play guy. He succeeds in the ways that you need the slot receiver to succeed in this Bills offense. Josh Allen likes to see dudes separate. He likes to see them come open early. You need to be able to read coverages and leverage on the inside of the field and between the hashes. He does that. He's got the size and the ability, at 6 feet, 198 pounds. So basically 6 foot, 200 pounds. He can survive going over the middle. He's got good hands. He's tough. I think he ticks almost any box you would want out of a slot receiver, but I don't necessarily think that he's there at 27. So this is where the rest of the wide receiver class starts to come into play when you are talking about this position grouping. Because if Jackson Smith-Njigba is there, every other receiver that I've got, even the ones that are top, whoever my wide, so Addison is my 2, Zay Flowers is my wide receiver 3, and everything is so jumbled even with them and everybody coming after that. But a lot of these guys have second round grades. Now, Does that mean they can't go at the end of the first round? Absolutely not. Like I've stated a bunch of times on the show, usually on any given year, there's really only 15 to 20 guys that have a true first round grade for most teams. Some years it'll, go up to like 23, 24, 25, but not every player that gets picked in the first round has a first round grade. So taking Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison or Josh Downs for some people at the back end of the first round. I understand that notion. I wouldn't take Josh Downs at the end of the first round. We'll get into that conversation in a minute as well. But if you're looking at the rest of this class, it's so, I don't want to say this wide receiver class is weak, but it's got a lot of questions about it for every tier that you go into. And a lot of them stem from that size and frame question. Even with somebody like Jordan Addison, right? Really good route runner, crisp, sudden, decisive routes. He's crafty. He can separate in the stem. He can separate in his breaks. Whereas Jackson Smith-Njigba is more smooth and fluid in his routes. Addison has more of that prototypical shake, that suddenness, that quick separation. Kind of, I don't want to say that Jordan Addison is Stephon Diggs, but a little bit like what Stephon Diggs does, where when he separates, it's quick, it's sudden, it's like the snap of a finger, and he creates 5, yards of separation almost in a heartbeat. Jordan Addison can do that. But you take in the size and frame concerns. 5'11", 173 pounds. He's fast enough, but he's not really fast. How is he going to fare against NFL corners with size and length and physicality? Is he best suited for the slot? He worked a bit more, significantly more outside at USC and even at Pitt than Jackson Smith-Njigba did at Ohio State. But because of his size and his frame, is he better suited for the slot? You even have someone like Zay Flowers, who is on that smaller side as well, both in terms of overall height, but then also with his arm length. He's got very, very short arms, which significantly reduces his catch radius. And a lot of the ways that Zay Flowers won at Boston College, granted, his offense did not do him any favors in terms of the quality of the cast that he was playing with, but also the system and the offense that they ran. I've talked about on the show before, it felt like they ran like the same 3 or 4 passing concepts, like over and over. He was either running like a drag or like a whip route or a Dino post, and just over and over and over. It was just kind of like, or Dino post, depending on how you view it there, like the same things over and over again from him. But a lot of the ways in which he won were due to his athleticism, his ability, kind of body guys through his routes, kind of create a soft shoulder like an edge rusher and go through somebody and then separate that way or win with his athleticism. And then when you saw him go up against more athletic competition, like Florida State, for example, you saw some struggles because he wasn't really able to win with that athleticism. I also didn't see a lot of separation versus man coverage in his game. I thought he was inconsistent with deception in his routes and suddenness. He was more of a kind of find a space guy than kind of create his own space. But he does win in the intermediate and the deeper intermediate and vertical. He's more of a downfield threat and a chunk play guy than he is a route runner, to work underneath. I think he can work on that piece of his game. But again, you are looking at somebody who is on that smaller side, who is not the prototypical NFL wide receiver 1 or even really wide receiver 2 type frame with his size. And I'm pulling up what he is right now. So 5'9", 182 pounds. And that 182 was at, I believe, the Shrine Bowl, but I think he measured at the combine. Yeah, he did. He measured at the combine at 182 as well. But really short arms, 29.25-inch arms. That's very short, even for like an NFL wide receiver or for a shorter wide receiver at that as well. So that catch radius is going to be limited a little bit. And are you looking for him to be able to continuously win with his athleticism at the next level? He's a good yak guy, yards after catch, run after catch. Can he consistently do that against equal caliber NFL talent? You kind of go back and forth with that, right? And then if we're looking at this wide receiver class as a whole, so those are just like my top 3, just to kind of bring them generally in together. But once you get past them, everything is just more and more questions in terms of how does the board potentially fall. So Josh Downs, I know a lot of people like Josh Downs. He's more of a slot only to me with his size and his frame. So he's another 5'8", 171 pounds, extremely crafty route runner. He is reminiscent when he runs routes of Cole Beasley, and I mean that as a compliment. He is unique as a route runner. He's very crafty. He's got his own pacing. He separates in different ways. He kind of like has like a hop skip and will pace things in a way to confuse defenders. He had one touchdown against Notre Dame where they kind of run a rub route in the red zone, and his man gets over the top of him and has leverage, and he's trying to go to the back pylon. So he hesitates and just gives him a little shake and crosses him up like a point guard, breaks his ankles, gets to the corner, but then the defender recovers. Ball goes into the air. He plays big at the catch point, goes up, gets it, kind of mosses the defender a little bit, plays big at the catch point, scores. But can he do that consistently in the NFL, right? At 5'8", 171 pounds, his arms are a little longer than Zay Flowers at 30 3/8, but it's still on the shorter side. Does he survive regularly? And you're looking at all these guys. Quentin Johnston, I know some people like Quentin Johnston from TCU, but his tape is inconsistent. What you have in him as a route runner is a question mark. He is a big-time body catcher. He will have some drops. He is a higher cut guy. A lot of his body is in the legs in terms of what he is. So his gait, his stride, it's longer, it's smoother, but he's not a big shake kind of guy. Even though he has a ton of, yards after catch, it's more from he'll catch a ball on a curl route or a stop route. I'm sure you folks have seen it over and over, the highlights against Kansas or the touchdown on the drag route against Michigan where he'll catch it. And he's really good at, as he catches it, using his peripheral vision to kind of notice where defenders are coming, and he'll catch it and he'll make one move and then he gets upfield in a heartbeat. But even with him, it was, well, he's this big guy. He's this fast guy. He ran at his pro day. He ran a 4.51. Not horrible, not super slow, but people were pegging him as a guy who was going to run like a 4.41 or the low 4.4s, maybe even gets into a 4.3. People thought that he was bigger and so he was going to be a 6'4", 4.4 guy, and he's 6'2" and some change, almost 6'3", and he runs a 4.51. I don't think he's bad, but he takes, from a skill set perspective, what are you introducing him to? There's just, long story short, whoever you are looking at, there's just questions and questions and questions for this wide receiver group in terms of top tier talent, in terms of fit, in terms of what you have in this class from a redundancy standpoint, a skill set standpoint. And again, there are guys to like. I don't want to make it seem like this class is bad. I like Jax. I like Addison. I like Zay Flowers. I like Josh Downs. I like Cedric Tillman. Joe Marino talked last week about Marvin Mims from Oklahoma. I like Jaden Reed at the back end of round 3 or into round 4. I like A.T. Perry. I really like Nathaniel Tank Dell. I really like Jonathan Mingo. I like Xavier Hutchinson. My point with all of it is, and ironically, Ron just said it right now. Ron says, I'd much rather take a shot. I'm assuming is what you meant there. I'd much rather take a shot on a wide receiver in the 3rd or later. And that's where my head is at with the wide receiver grouping. I don't think Jack's fall. If Jackson Smith and Jigba fell to 27, this changes the nature of the entire conversation. But I really don't believe he's there. And again, this is part of the reason why I put him on the graphic. If he's not there, is there a receiver that is worth pick 27 above the offensive tackles that could potentially be there, above the linebackers that are there, given the need that linebacker is, or even edge, or even defensive tackle, and some of these other positional needs, given the question marks that exist around these wide receivers? Because something that I think also that needs to be kept in mind, and I mentioned it on Twitter last week, for me, again, I like Jackson Smith and Jigba. If he's your wide receiver 1, that's fine. If you put him in last year's draft class, for me, he doesn't crack the top 5. I don't think he passes Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Jameson Williams, Chris Olave, or Jahan Dotson. So if you are getting somebody who's the best at their position group or towards the top of their position group in a draft, you can't necessarily look at it in a vacuum. So if you got a guy at a position that's, part of a weaker class, right? And we'll use wide receiver as an example. If you get a top 3 wide receiver in this draft, cool. You got a top 3 wide receiver in this draft. But once the draft is done, that player is going into the larger talent pool that is the NFL. So you can't look at it in a vacuum and be like, oh, well, I got a top 3 wide receiver. Okay, when you go into the NFL, where does that wide receiver rank? And with the question marks that exist, I think it's just fair. I think it's fair to have questions about that wide receiver grouping in terms of representing proper value there at 27. And to Ron's point, he says, I'd much rather take a shot on a wide receiver in the third or later. That's very much where I'm at. I would rather have some combination of linebacker, tackle, edge, defensive tackle in that first round, given who I think will be there. And then pair that with, again, if we're talking wide receivers in the third or fourth round, pairing that with, a Jonathan Mingo, or I know, again, a Jaden Reed, if you want to get that slot piece, or Tyler Scott from Cincinnati, if he's there in the third round, or maybe even Josh Downs, if he falls to 59. And despite the size for Tank Dell, I like what Tank Dell offers. I would much rather pair a later wide receiver with an earlier position of need, and kind of go from there in terms of seeing where and what they do. I want to grab some of the comments here. Comment here from Wait says, all the wide receivers in this draft need development. I think they'll fall into later rounds 2 through 7. I think a lot of it will be determined on need, right? If you're looking at like Josh Downs, for example, how much do you need a slot receiver, and how important is a slot receiver to your offense? Like, I think Josh Downs would be more important to the Bills than a lot of other teams, given how much they run 11 and given the type of skill set that he has. The way he plays the slot is what the Bills need and like from a slot receiver. And again, he fits Josh Allen. Quick separator, can beat man, can leverage space against zone, wins early, wins often, wins in definitive ways that make life easy for your quarterback. But I don't know, maybe you're an offense that wants more of a big guy. Maybe you want more of a power slot because you have more of a run game to your piece, right? Maybe you want to reduce the split of that slot receiver and have him function as kind of like a quasi tight end in moments, and you need him to do more blocking. So maybe Josh Downs isn't even in your top 50 because the type of skill set and frame that he has isn't conducive to what you want to run on offense. So much of it is going to be dependent on where you see scheme fits and skill set fits based on offensive systems, as there is for any position every year. But wide receiver, because it's so redundant this year with frame and size, I think it's murkier than a lot of other years. Oh, appreciate you, Y in here saying great show. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Question here from Roy. Roy says, what's the latest round you see wide receivers being available that could actually contribute this year? I feel comfortable in the third round. I think if you could get Jonathan Mingo in the third round, he can legitimately contribute. And I even think you could get some meaningful snaps from a Xavier Hutchinson or Parker Washington. Again, it's going to be dependent on how the board falls and what these teams go with. But I think you could get legitimate contributions. Again, legitimate, I'm saying like a guy who is going to give you real snaps and quality snaps. I'm not basing it on target share and snap percentage, just a guy who could give you like real meaningful snaps. I think you could easily get that into the third round this year and then going into the fourth. Again, remember like Khalil Shakir had a good rookie year. I know people wanted more from him and more usage from him. Khalil Shakir was a 5th round pick last year. Wide receivers always kind of fall. So maybe there are guys who creep into the 5th round this year. Maybe Xavier Hutchinson lasts until the 5th round. And then I would say, I think, guys in the 5th round would be able to contribute. Right now, based on how I think the board falls, I'm going to say into the 4th. I would be comfortable taking a receiver in the 3rd or 4th round in this year's draft and having them give me meaningful snaps. That's also part of the reason why I don't want to go wide receiver early. I'm cool if they go wide receiver early because I like some of the guys, but there's just questions around size and frame. And if you're going to have those questions, which are going to impact health and longevity and sustainability at that position, especially at a position that, okay, next year, is Gabe Davis going to stay? If he has a good year, does he sign for big money somewhere else? Do they re-sign him? And then you're going in with more redundancy in terms of size and frame and skill set for this Bills receiver group, because Diggs isn't the biggest guy. Khalil Shakir isn't the biggest guy. Okay, if you take Jordan Addison, then you're running the whole Smurf offense again, which isn't bad, but again, redundancy. Not to mention, that takes Smurf to a whole nother level, like with the size at what Jordan Addison is, at the size at which Zay Flowers is in terms of arm length coupled with the overall frame. So there's a lot of questions for the wide receiver grouping. And I think the strength of this wide receiver class is in rounds 2 and 3 and 4. I don't think this group is a tremendously strong top tier group. Last year, I thought it was really good, almost top to bottom, but especially, day 1, day 2, and into day 3 with what you had. Again, at the top of last year's class with what you got from Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Jameson Williams is kind of an afterthought because he spent the majority of the year hurt. We'll see what he is in year 2 for the Lions. And then what Jahan Dotson was able to do, even though he was banged up at times. Treylon Burks, somebody who I wasn't even that high on last year, he went to the Titans last year. When he was healthy, he played well. Last year's wide receiver class had a lot of top-tier, top-end value. I don't think this year's class necessarily has that, mainly because around the questions that exist for their size and frame. This draft will be very important, I think, in terms of potentially determining what we see from NFL teams going with wide receivers in the future, because so many of these guys are outliers in terms of their size, frame. And I'm talking like height, I'm talking weight, I'm talking arm length, I'm talking like build, how much muscle mass do they have? If these guys can survive, if the Jordan Addisons of the world can thrive in the NFL despite being, more of a slight or slender frame, if they don't get bodied, if they don't get out muscled, if they don't get out physical at the NFL level, if Tank Dell survives at the NFL level, if we see these guys be able to build and work towards sustainability, this could potentially shift what teams look for in wide receivers, because a lot of these guys, especially towards the top, they are very non-traditional in terms of their builds. And I think that's a significant question mark for a lot of these guys. And it just adds to, if you're the Bills, when you want contributions now, but you need contributions going forward, you really need to hit some of these draft picks early as you got more decisions coming down the road for other positions in terms of free agency and where you fill in 2024 and beyond. Do you want more question marks? Can you afford to have more question marks? Can you afford to have more doubt and mercurial natures in positions than you've already got? I just think it's not a spot I necessarily want to be in. So for receiver, I love Jax. I think that is the ideal fit. And I like Josh Downs' fit as well, but I don't think Downs is a first-round guy. So if you're looking at the receiver group, I think it is weaker towards the top, mainly because of the question marks, again, that surround a lot of these guys in terms of size and frame, but also skill set pieces. I think the strength for wide receiver is in rounds 2 through 4. I think you can get real quality. Again, and this isn't just for the Bills, it's for everybody. I think you can get real quality rounds 2, 3, and 4, especially early round 4 if you are a team looking for wide receiver help. I think you could get that in rounds 2 through 4. So I don't think the value is necessarily at the top if we're talking strengths and weaknesses for wide receiver. Now, let's move on to linebacker. And this one, I've said it before, I think this position grouping is one that is such a large domino effect for the entire draft for the Buffalo Bills. But the linebacker is really the only hole that exists on this team. Like I mentioned in the intro, there's a lot of upgradable positions for the Buffalo Bills team, offensively and defensively. And they've raised the floor of a lot of those positions this offseason by adding reinforcements. Wide receiver, offensive line, mainly guard specifically, the running back addition with Damian Harris and restructuring Hines. Even the one-offs at edge with Shaq Lawson, defensive tackle Jordan Phillips, offensive tackle David Quessenberry, which aren't amazing, but they're still moves. Linebacker, they brought back Terrell Dodson, but he's never really seen real meaningful minutes with any kind of regularity. And that doesn't mean that he can't, right? That doesn't mean that he can't blossom into a beautiful butterfly or blossom into a beautiful flower. I kind of messed up my metamorphosis analogies there, but it doesn't matter. It also doesn't mean that Terrell Bernard can't be the guy and go forward. But Tremaine Edmunds was a significant piece of the defense, both in terms of his role and what his skill set allowed the defense to do. And they seemingly have not really done anything to address the linebacker position now that Tremaine Edmunds has left. So, actually, I want to grab this comment real quick. So Nikki G says, Dorsey can't even scheme open Knox, a 4-year tight end. A rookie won't help this year. I see this comment a lot. And I know Dorsey had his struggles. Some of that is on Dawson Knox in terms of not being the most polished route runner and separating. But also some of this, Dawson Knox was open a bunch. Josh Allen just didn't go to him. There were a bunch of times where Josh Allen had Dawson Knox in the intermediate or underneath, and he chose to go somewhere else. I'm not saying Ken Dorsey is perfect, but I think a lot of this Ken Dorsey conversation is low-hanging fruit and being used to kind of just gloss over a whole bunch of other issues. There were times where Knox didn't get open, and that's due to Dawson Knox. And there's also times where Knox was open and Josh Allen didn't go to him. Now, could Ken Dorsey scheme him open better? Yes, absolutely. Everybody can always do something better. But I don't think Dawson Knox's usage and production is necessarily all on Ken Dorsey. There are a multitude of variables and factors that went into why Knox isn't maybe being as productive as he potentially could be given his skill set. Some of that is on Knox. Some of that is on Josh Allen going other places. There's even times I broke it down in film on Twitter and in shows where you've got, was it the Dolphins playoff game? I don't think it was the Cincinnati game. So many of these games are just a blur to me, where Knox is open on overs and drag routes and Allen's just looking to the other side of the field. Or you know what? Maybe Knox is clearing from right to left and Allen's going to have Knox, but Allen got pressured from the left and now Allen has to roll out to the right. There's a multitude of variables that go into it. To just lump it onto Ken Dorsey, I don't necessarily think is the right thing. And that's my view for anything when it comes to football. Like, there are so many variables that impact every single play on every single snap. And to kind of just lay it at the feet of one player or one thing, whether it's a coach, whether it's a side of the ball, again, sometimes it can lay at the feet of one person, one player, but more often than not, there's a multitude of factors that go into why something does or doesn't work. And again, I'm not picking on you in particular, Nikki. But I just see this comment a lot where people just, oh, well, they can't do this because of Dorsey. And I feel like so much is getting put onto him as the easy blame. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate, but to each their own. So linebacker, not Ken Dorsey and not tight end. Tremaine Edmonds, significant piece of the defense, both in terms of his role and what his skill set allowed the defense to do. And they seemingly have not really done anything this offseason to address his departure. Now, if you are filling this linebacker spot in the NFL draft, for me, it comes down to 3 players. For the audio people only, I took a drink. That's why there was a pause. For me, it comes down to 3 players. Iowa linebacker Jack Campbell, Clemson linebacker Trenton Simpson, and Drew Sanders. Now, this isn't to say that some other linebacker couldn't potentially work or couldn't fit, so on and so forth. But I don't think a lot of the other linebackers in this class make sense. One, this linebacker class is not great. For me, I don't have a true first-round grade on any of the linebackers, even the guys at the top that I mentioned. But given the talent cliff that we spoke about last week with Joe Marino that exists at this position, if you want to fill the positional need that the Bills have at linebacker, if you want to fill that in this draft, you almost have to go early. You almost have to go early or hope that one of the 3 guys that I mentioned drops to 59 or somewhere in round 2 where you can trade up. This is also part of the reason why I mentioned this is the biggest domino in this draft. So when you're looking at the linebackers in this class that aren't Jack Campbell, Trenton Simpson, or Drew Sanders, a lot of them don't make sense from a schematic perspective. There's a lot of positional redundancy with Terrell Bernard, for example, from a skill set perspective. Then there's questions around scheme fits versus what the role has been for that linebacker spot traditionally. Again, like I mentioned earlier, when talking about Sean McDermott's tenure in Carolina, maybe the Bills defense changes a little bit. Maybe they tweak some things. Maybe they go in a different direction with what they ask of their linebackers. That's tied to, again, a systematic piece. But until we see that, I think it's hard to necessarily project that or predict that. So I'm not saying that the Bills couldn't take Deion Henley or Dorian Williams or Damarian Overshown from Texas or any of the names that I continue to see populate from people on Twitter. But a lot of those guys, one, aren't plug and play. Like, they're not guys who you're going to put into a stack linebacker off-ball spot in the box, and they're going to be able to stack and shed and read and diagnose and process what's happening in front of them and make plays against the run and the pass. That's not the role they occupied in college, and to expect them to be able to occupy that role right off the bat in the NFL, I think that's a lot of projection. Like, if you take Deion Henley or Dorian Williams or Damarian Overshown, are they better to start right now than Terrell Bernard? I think that's a significant question. And then if that's a significant question, then you're in the same spot as last year where you're taking a linebacker in round 2 or 3 that, are they a starter? Are they a special teams guy? Are they a backup? What's the real value there? And not only are those guys not necessarily plug and play guys right away, they don't necessarily have defined fits in a lot of instances, and especially in the Bills defense. So, like Deion Henley, for example. I like Deion Henley, linebacker from Washington State. I think he's more of a will linebacker. He's more of the Matt Milano style. He blitzes, he rushes, he'll rush off the edge, he'll play as the apex or the overhang defender. Same thing with Dorian Williams, doesn't stack and shed, isn't great at getting off blocks in the box. He plays fast because he is physically fast, but he's not there necessarily as a processor. He also rushes off the edge in third downs. Damarian Overshawn from Texas, who I like, he plays as an apex overhang, edge rusher, jack of all trades kind of guy who's better functioning in space than he is in the box. He's almost kind of like a Trenton Simpson light. So a lot of these names, again, that aren't Jack Campbell, Trenton Simpson, and Drew Sanders, a lot of them aren't necessarily a scheme fit, and a lot of them aren't necessarily ready to play in 2023. And if that's the case, then you're kind of just kicking the can down the road. And if you take a linebacker that's more developmental, okay, then we're in the same position as we were last year, where you took a guy in the top 3 rounds that isn't ready to play and contribute this year. And is he going to be ready and contribute? Because if they can't beat out Terrell Bernard this year, are they going to beat out Terrell Bernard next year? It's just a whole bunch of questions that I don't think you necessarily need or potentially want to have. And so to Tristan's comment here, Bernard has a year in the system at the least. Exactly. That also helps Terrell Bernard. So if you're bringing in someone who is, from a skill set perspective and size and frame, redundant because they occupy a lot of the same world that Terrell Bernard occupies, the edge is probably going to Terrell Bernard to start. And so if that's going to happen anyway, you might as well roll with Terrell Bernard. But and see, Elizabeth says a similar thing. If you don't get one of the best, just play Bernard and get a huge dude to help keep him clean. I'm actually a fan of that to a certain degree. And Steven comes in and says, Elizabeth makes sense. So that's why, again, the skill set, the positional redundancy from a skill set perspective, scheme fit, and what the role has been, I don't think makes sense for a lot of the linebackers. So that's why I'm the top 3, if you're going to take one in terms of addressing this linebacker position in this class. Again, we're talking strengths and weaknesses of this class. Overall, this linebacker class is very meh. A lot of these guys you're hoping like, oh, okay, like maybe a sub package role or maybe a special teams role or a developmental guy that could be something, in 2024 or 2025. There's not a lot of guys who you're going to take this year and plug and play and have them receive 80 to 90% of your snaps on defense and have them be a functional cog on a good defensive football team. Like maybe you plug them in and their role is minimal or they're a starter, but there's a lot of star power on the rest of their defense. So there's not as much spotlight or shine on them. Or to go to the comment from Elizabeth earlier, maybe you put them on a team that has a tremendous defensive line. And so they're able to just stay clean and they can make plays all day. But a lot of the linebackers in this class don't tick the boxes in terms of being guys who can succeed on their own. And for a Bills defense that has questions on the defensive line, putting one of these non-skill set, non-fit guys like a Deion Henley or a Damarian Overshawn or a Dorian Williams, guys who need more time to develop, who need more seasoning, putting them into a situation where they kind of have to sink or swim also is not a recipe for success. But I mentioned those 3 guys, Jack Campbell, Trenton Simpson, Drew Sanders. Jack Campbell to me is the best fit for what the current role is of that linebacker spot in this Bills defense. He's the best fit in terms of the combination of coverage plus his play style in the box. But even he has inconsistency in his game. He's inconsistent in terms of stacking and shedding. Some of that is his short arms. He is on the shorter side, not alligator arm kind of guy or T-Rex arms, but he does have shorter arms, especially considering he's 6'4" and 250 pounds. Like for his size and frame, he's got shorter arms. What I like with him, though, is, again, it's the combination of what he does in coverage and versus the run. He processes quickly and accurately. He's smart. He communicates well. And that's all just against the run. In coverage, he's able to match coverage. He can mirror tight ends and running backs. He can pick up some slot receivers or some guys. He's athletic. He's fluid. He's not going to have the range that Tremaine Edmonds does because no one will. But he's good enough in coverage, and he's good against the run. He's the best overall combination for me. I also think he fits with Matt Milano, given the type of player Matt Milano is. Matt Milano is a disruptor. He creates havoc. He shoots the gaps. He's the guy who just, you kind of just drop him in there and you watch everything kind of explode. Jack Campbell, because of his smarts and his intelligence and the way he plays responsibly and diagnoses well. He's the guy that can clean up the mess and the havoc that Matt Milano creates. And I think that pairing fits very well. You have Trenton Simpson, linebacker from Clemson. He's more of just an overall athlete, and his selection for me could potentially signal a scheme change. His role at Clemson was he's kind of playing like a big nickel and playing as that apex or that overhang defender, which is that, kind of line that player that splits the outside corner and the end man on the line of scrimmage, that edge rusher, right? So he would play as that apex or that overhang. He would play in the box. He would blitz off the edge. He would blitz in the gap. He would do a ton of things for the Clemson defense. He wore a lot of hats. He had some reps that where he lined up at safety before this past year. Very athletic, ran a 4.43. He's a guy who I think at Clemson was a jack of all trades. I like the idea of instead of making him a jack of all trades at the NFL level, you narrow his scope. And instead of being a jack of all trades, you make him just a master of a couple and see if he can progress. Put him into the box with more regularity and see if his processing and reading and recognition gets a little bit better. He's fast, he's twitchy, he's athletic. I think he just needs more work on the mental side of things and a little bit on the, stacking and shedding piece in the box. But again, a lot of that is because he wasn't doing that with regularity, because a lot of times he's living out there in space. He isn't exactly, I don't want to say he's, a square peg in a round hole. He's more like an oval peg in a round hole where he kind of fits, but also kind of doesn't. So if the Bills were to take him, I think that signals potentially a scheme change in the Bills defense because, he can carry some wide receivers and tight ends vertically. Needs to do a better job of, tracking the ball and, finishing at the catch point defensively. But that can be worked on. If they go with him, are they leaning into more diversified fronts and diversified looks in terms of confusing offenses and changing the pre to post snap picture, not just from a back end coverage standpoint, but from a front standpoint in terms of just throwing athleticism and chaos and aggressive havoc at an offense in terms of your players and their skill sets, but also in terms of the looks that you present them to the point where an offense has no idea who's rushing, who's dropping to the flats, who's dropping to the hook curls. Are they in man? Are they in zone? What kind of zone are they in? Where are the safeties dropping to? Who's doing what? How do we set the protection? Okay, are we going to slide? Are we doing man protection? Do I keep a running back in to protect? Do I got a motion in the tight end? Do I need a 6-man protection or a 7-man protection? Trent Simpson is a move towards that, this term that gets used all the time, the positionless football aspect, right? I think he could fit into Tremaine Edmunds' role, but he's more of a longer-term development piece, whereas Jack Campbell, I think, is plug and play and is ready right now. Simpson, I think, needs a bit more of a learning curve, although he is a tremendous athlete. And then you have Drew Sanders from Arkansas, who is, from a scheme fit perspective, and I put a tweet out about this earlier today, a lot of Drew Sanders' value is tied to his ability to drop down to the line of scrimmage and rush on third downs or obvious passing downs. And he's a good edge rusher. He's got a good inside move. He's got some length on him so he can win with swims and arm overs. He's also a good spiker and looper. He's good on stunts. The Bills don't do that with their linebackers. We don't. I made the Tremaine Edmunds joke for so long because people wanted him to blitz more and come off the edge, even though that wasn't in his skill set and was not in his repertoire. Despite the sacks that he had at Virginia Tech, a lot of them were cleanup sacks. They weren't because he was winning one-on-one in pass rush, although that's a conversation for another time. But the Bills have not done that with their linebackers. So Drew Sanders, I think he also needs more work than Jack Campbell when it comes to playing in the box. He's a dude who didn't see a ton of time at Alabama. He transferred from Alabama to Arkansas, really only played this one full-time year, but had a tremendous year for Arkansas in this really, kind of 1 year of production. But he's somebody who will miss tackles. He's not the most consistent guy with taking on blocks or diagnosing things in the box, but because he's athletic, because he's versatile, he's a guy that intrigues a lot of teams. But again, a lot of his value is tied to what you can do with him from an edge rushing perspective on third downs, and in pass rushing situations. So now, if you add in a guy who his skill set isn't necessarily plug and play, right, in terms of the level that you might want or need in a stack linebacker, off-ball linebacker spot, plus missed tackles, plus a significant chunk of his value being in a rush capacity that the Bills really haven't done, I don't necessarily see the fit. But what's interesting is if you do take Drew Sanders, because you need a linebacker, but then also you need more edge rushing juice. I think Von Miller, like I've talked about, I don't want to get into it too much, but Von Miller misses a chunk of the beginning of the season, I think, for me. I think he misses September and October. I think the safe window for him to return is really end of October, end of November. Again, going into his 33, 34-year season, this is the second time he's torn that ACL. Don't want to rush him back, although I know he is a metahuman and a freak and takes tremendous care of his body. But even if he is back, your edge rushing group is Von Miller, Greg Rousseau, AJ Epinesa, and Boogie Basham. Basham is, I take him or leave him at this point, although I don't want to make concrete decisions on a player until they finish their third year, but he's been a whole lot of nothing so far. AJ Epinesa, I think, is fine as a 3, but he's more suited as a 4. He had a strong end of the year from an advanced metric and tape standpoint in 2022, but you'd still like a little more there. You need reinforcements for your edge grouping, even though they brought Shaq Lawson back. We know what he is. We know what he isn't. It's a fine signing for depth. He should not be your edge 2 for a defense. He was down the stretch last year once Von Miller went down. What's interesting with Drew Sanders is if the Bills take him, then you have a third down package where you take Drew Sanders, you kick him down to the defensive line, and you can just play a whole bunch of games on the defensive line. You could use him as an edge rusher. You can line him up in the A gap. You could line him up over a guard or center. You could play a whole bunch of games in terms of what defensive linemen are on the field and who's lined up where. And then you take Taylor Rapp and you put him in as the dime linebacker. So your off-ball linebackers, quote unquote, on third downs or passing downs are Taylor Rapp and Matt Milano. So all of a sudden you take Drew Sanders and now you fill the linebacker need, but you also kind of help yourself from an edge rusher standpoint. You kind of potentially fill multiple needs in a way. So that's an interesting piece when it comes to the linebacker grouping as well. Sanders, from a Bills perspective, is third on my list after Campbell and after Trenton Simpson. In an ideal world, the Bills can just go best player available at wide receiver or tackle, offensive tackle or defensive tackle or edge or whatever. They can go best player available in round 1. And in an ideal world, Jack Campbell or Trenton Simpson falls to 59. Maybe even Drew Sanders. Although, again, I don't love that fit and I have questions about it schematically. But like I talked about, that's a huge risk and that's a huge ask and hope to expect one of those dudes to fall to 59. And again, overall, this linebacker class isn't great. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't have a true first-round grade on any of the linebackers, Campbell, Simpson, Sanders. And when I say true first-round grade, I mean like this guy's a first-round guy, not like, this guy's like a first-round, second-round guy. Now, that doesn't mean I'd be opposed to taking one of them at 27. I'd be fine if the Bills took Jack Campbell at 27 for 2 reasons. One, he's got a close enough grade where, you put him into the first round, that's fine. But 2, that talent cliff, that positional drop-off, and this is where we talk about the strengths and weaknesses of a class and how it shapes the board. I don't think going linebacker at 27 is the best value and is the best decision in round 1. But the drop-off from the linebackers that you can get in round 1 versus who I think will be there at 59 is significant. Even though the top tier of linebackers aren't as good as the top tier of wide receivers necessarily, or the top tier of tackles, or the top tier of edge rushers or defensive tackles, so on and so forth, all these other first round potential guys and player tiers that are available there, the drop off from a skill set and fit standpoint for the Bills and really for this linebacker class as a whole is significant from the top 3 versus whoever else. And that's why I don't love the idea of linebacker in the first round, but I really think it makes the most sense. Like if you don't go linebacker at 27, I don't think you're getting one of those 3 guys at 59. I really don't. And it gets murky. And then all of a sudden, okay, you're leaning into Terrell Bernard and Matt Milano. Okay, cool. Can you reinforce the defensive line enough to keep them clean? Because you don't want Terrell Bernard at his size and his frame taking on blockers left and right in the box, even like you did for Tremaine Edmonds. Edmonds is bigger and longer, and he struggled with it at times. Granted, it's not just size and frame. Some of that is, how they play the game and how they see the game. But then all of a sudden, are you setting your linebackers up for failure? terms of what you're looking at, this linebacker class is not strong. There is good value from a developmental special teams sub package standpoint. Like there's good value in what Henley and Overshone and Dorian Williams and Henry To'oTo'o from Alabama, like what these guys can offer in a sub package depth development kind of spot for some more than others. But in terms of strength being, hey, there's a bunch of guys that you can draft and they're ready to go in 2023. I don't think that's necessarily the case. So overall, I think this linebacker class is weak at the top. Also, overall, that doesn't mean there aren't good players in it, but a lot of it is going to be determined by scheme fit, skill set, plug and play ability, developmental course. It's real murky. And good question here from Tristan. If we drafted Mozzie Smith at 27, would you like that more or less than Campbell? More, but I really, really, really like Mozzie Smith. I also want the Bills to beef up the interior. So I would prefer Mozzie Smith, but here's the trade-off, right? I would prefer in a vacuum, I would prefer Mozzie Smith over Jack Campbell. But if you told me the options are Mozzie Smith and no linebacker, or Jack Campbell at 27 and then Keanu Benton at 59, I would take Jack Campbell and Keanu Benton. And see, that's where the balancing act comes in. That's where knowing the strengths and weaknesses of the class as a whole go within this conversation. And that's how it determines the board. If we're just talking in a vacuum one-off, I would take Mozzie Smith over Jack Campbell. But if you take Mozzie Smith, just like if you take Jack Campbell, it sets off a chain reaction in terms of what you can get later. So as much as I think Mozzie Smith is the better player and I'd rather have him, I think you do your team a better service by getting Campbell and Keanu Benton, or Campbell and even like Siaki Ika or something like that. Like in an ideal world, the Bills get Campbell and then get Keanu Benton. I'm going to talk about defensive tackle in a minute, but so that's why it's tricky in a vacuum. Mozzie Smith over Jack Campbell, but you got to play the if-then game, right? So if you take Mozzie Smith at 27, then what do you get at 59? What do you get at 91? What do you get for linebacker? What other opportunities do you have? When Tristan says, I'm worried Benton might go before our second pick, I'm worried about a lot of things in this draft, but that's fair. Steven says, Mozzie Smith is not even listed in the linebacker position group. Mozzie Smith's a defensive tackle from Michigan. Big-bodied, run stuffer. Doesn't have a lot of pass rush pop to his game, but he's got a high motor. He gets low. He drives. He's physical. He's a really fun guy. But yeah, that's actually a really good conversation piece from Tristan there, because that's the game you got to play, and that's where knowing the strengths and weaknesses of the position groups within themselves, but against other groups, that's where it comes into play. Because I think you can still get a good defensive tackle in round 2 or round 3, but you're not going to be able to get a linebacker that you need in round 2 or round 3. And that's where the conversation is. Good piece. Good piece. Let's move on to our next position grouping here. Well, position groupings, defensive tackle and edge. So talking about defensive tackles, spoke about it a little bit just now with Mr. Mozzie Smith from the University of Michigan. As I pull up some of my notes here, I always know how far we've gone in the offseason based on how much I have to scroll through my notes to get to where I want to get to. So talking about the defensive tackle grouping, I like the round 1 defensive tackles, obviously. The Jalen Carters, Brian Brzee has grown on me a bit, which we'll talk about. But I really think a lot of the value for defensive tackle is in rounds 2 and 3 in this draft, really from early round 2 through the end of round 2 and through round 3, again, depending on how the board falls. We just mentioned Mozzie Smith. He could go round 1. I think he lands as an early 2. And so you're looking at Mozzie Smith, Keanu Benton, Siaki Ika, Javon Dexter, Zach Pickens, Kobe Turner, Adebayor from Northwestern, depending on if you view him as a defensive tackle or an edge, either way, defensive line player. There's some value in Colby Wooden from Auburn. I even like Moro Ojomo from Texas, more of a smaller kind of 3-tech Ed Oliver type of guy for teams. You've got Jacqueline Roy Carl Brooks from Bowling Green is listed as a defensive tackle, but he's got some edge pops, so it depends on what you're running as a defense schematically. But I think there's a lot of value in rounds 2 through 3 if you're looking at the defensive tackle grouping. And in an ideal world, I think the Bills address defensive tackle in round 2. In an ideal world, like I mentioned earlier, like Keanu Benton, I think is the pick at 59. The Bills need defensive tackle reinforcements for 2023 and beyond. As we've mentioned a bunch on the show, defensive tackles right now for 2023, the top 4, Daquan Jones, Ed Oliver, Jordan Phillips, Tim Settle. Jordan Phillips has legitimate injury concerns and an injury history that followed him from Arizona to Buffalo. Not even talking about the shoulder injury last year. Let's talk about the hamstring against Tennessee. So if he's in your top 4, you already need a 5th because odds are he's probably going to get banged up. Tim Settle was a disappearing act on film throughout the year. Granted, he had some injury stuff, but from an advanced metric standpoint, he had one of the worst years for all defensive tackles in all of football. And then in 2024, you don't have anyone signed in your defensive tackle grouping. So the Bills need defensive tackle support for 2023 and for the future because they literally have no defensive tackles under contract for 2024 and beyond. So I would like to address that spot early. But again, I think there's good value in rounds 2 and 3 and potentially 4, depending on who falls. So there's good middle day 2 value at defensive tackle. I don't think you necessarily have to go early with, even if someone like Brian Brzee from Clemson, who potentially may be falling, he's someone who I thought would have no chance of landing at 27 to the Bills just because of what he potentially could be, but he's had some injury concerns these past couple of years. But you watch the tape for Brian Brzee and 6'5", 298 pounds, really great get off. He pairs that with quick hands. He's got to swim, he's got to swipe, he's got good hand placement on stack and sheds. He grips right on, he'll get both hands right on the neckline of his opponent's shoulder pads and just kind of control them and shed them. But he does have those injury concerns. Tore his ACL in 2021, had a shoulder injury that he had surgery on in January 2022, but he's versatile up front. He can play a 3-tech, he can play a nose, shade him over the center. He can line up at a 4-eye, line up in as a 5 on the edge. You can really use him in a variety of ways depending on what kind of defense you're running. He's also got good lateral agility to jump gaps on runs and stunts. He, I think, is legitimate first-round talent. I don't think he's necessarily going to be there at 27. I think despite the injury concerns and some of the up and down play that I think stems from the injuries that he was playing with, I don't think he's going to be there at 27. I would be okay if he is the pick at 27. I think Brian Brzee is a real quality player. But like I mentioned, the strength of the defensive tackle class for me, I do think it's a good class from a top end perspective with what you can get in rounds 1 through 3. But I think the real strength of it is rounds 2 and 3. And again, could be into round 4, depending on who falls and how the board shakes out. But this defensive tackle class is strong in rounds 2 and rounds 3. Now, the edge grouping is, I just feel like talking about defensive line again, it goes hand in hand. A lot of it, I mentioned this before, it ties into the archetype that the Bills look for at edge. They look for big, long, pocket compressor guys. They don't really look for bendy, athletic moves kind of guys that get around the arc. So if you're familiar with the guys in this draft, they don't really look towards a BJ Ojulari. They look more towards a Zach Harrison from Ohio State, or as athletic as they get would be more of like an Isaiah Foskey from Notre Dame, who's athletic and has some burst and some juice, but is more of a physical pocket compressor kind of guy. But if you're looking at the edge grouping, this is a deep, deep group from rounds 1 through 4. Who goes where will be determined by system and scheme. There's guys in this class who are bendy, athletic guys. You've got compressed the pocket guys. You've got hybrid guys who can rush, but who can also drop into coverage. So if you're running a 3-4 or more of, an odd front type of defense, that lends itself, to those kind of guys lend themselves to your system of boards than others. So like wide receiver and really like a lot of these positions, but especially this year, who goes where for the edge grouping in this draft class will be heavily determined by what teams are looking for based on their individual scheme fit needs. I would like the Bills to get an edge rusher in this draft. Like I talked about this, this is potentially tied into why Drew Sanders could potentially be appealing because he can kick down to edge, but I don't see it happening early for the Bills. I don't think the Bills go edge at 27, mainly because I think they have to go linebacker early um, at 27. And even if they don't, maybe one of those guys fall to 59. But even if they do, I don't even want to play that game because I don't think they fall. I still think the better value is on the interior defensive line in round 2. But the good news with edge, you can get some depth in rounds 3 through 4. The bad news is that it's probably just going to be depth, which isn't bad. The Bills need depth in 2023. And this is another position grouping. They have guys signed in for 2024, but it's literally just Von Miller, Greg Rousseau, and Boogie Basham, which isn't, again, necessarily ideal. But you look at the edge grouping for the draft here, and like I mentioned, I think this is a good group. You've got legitimate first-round talent, but you've also got good value going into rounds 2 and 3. If we're talking first-round guys that I don't think come close to the Bills, Will Anderson, Tyree Wilson, Lucas Van Ness. I guess there's a small world where Lucas Van Ness falls. I don't think he gets anywhere close to where the Bills can make a move. Nolan Smith, Georgia, lit up the combine, plays like a velociraptor, bendy, athletic, twitchy, can drop into coverage, played that jack linebacker spot at Georgia, but he is undersized. Can he live full-time on the edge? What does he do against tackles who have size and length on him and who win first touch? I like Nolan Smith. I think he goes before the Bills have a chance at him. I legitimately think there's probably 5 edges that go in the first round. Will Anderson, Tyree Wilson, Lucas Van Ness. This isn't in order, but just guys. Will Anderson, Tyree Wilson, Lucas Van Ness, Nolan Smith, and Myles Murphy from Clemson. Myles Murphy may be there for the Bills at 27. His tape wasn't great. His pro day and his measurables weren't great. I could see him being a guy that the Bills like. I wouldn't hate the pick, but I wouldn't love it just because I didn't love his tape. I thought he was kind of above average at everything. Really good run defender, physical, but not really necessarily what I'm looking for overall to kind of answer the bell at edge. And then if you're going into like late first or early second round guys, you've got BJ Ojulari, you've got Felix Anudike-Uzomah, you've got the Derek Halls of the world, the Will McDonalds, you've got Isaiah Foskey. Like there's legitimately 10 or 11 good edge rushers that'll go between the first and second round, maybe early third. And then when you start to get into the third and fourth rounds, that's where you get the Zach Harrisons, the Tuli Pelotu. He's from USC. Isaiah McGuire from Missouri, some people like. I mentioned Carl Brooks as a defensive tackle. I think you could also potentially put him out at edge if you wanted to. KJ Henry from Clemson offers you some good run stopping ability, the other edge from Clemson. And then there's guys like late, like I like Viliami Fahoku. I think he could be a 4th or a 5th round guy. There is good value in I like this comment from Claude. Claude says Myles Murphy is basically Shaq Lawson. I hate scouting the helmet, as they say. And I don't want to see Myles Murphy and be like, oh, he's Shaq Lawson. So like whatever. But yeah, kind of. And I don't know if that's clouding my judgment. It makes me worried a little bit. And Claude, as you said earlier, if Myles Murphy or Lucas Van Ness fall, the Bills would be all over it. I really think they would. Van Ness ticks every box. Big guy. He's athletic, but he can compress the pocket. I think he's what the Bills would want in an edge rusher. He fits the archetype. So does Myles Murphy to a degree. I think if Myles Murphy was there, he could be the pick. I wouldn't hate it. I wouldn't love it if it's Myles Murphy. I would prefer Lucas Van Ness. I don't think he falls, but archetype rears its head so much when it comes to the Bills edge grouping. So we'll see there. But Steven says PFF says there's 7 edge rushers with first round grades. Fair. Everybody grades differently, but I think there end up probably being at least 5 edge rushers that go in the first round. Maybe you get a 6th or a 7th. Maybe they creep into the end of the first. Maybe Ojulari or Anudike-Uzomah go, or Will McDonald. Maybe somebody likes Keon White, really physical, athletic dude, kind of prototypically built NFL body from Georgia Tech. But depends on how you view him. Some people, maybe want to put him at defensive tackle and use him as a 3-tech or in different situations. But this is a deep edge grouping. So if the Bills don't go edge early, it's okay. I think you can still get value in rounds 3 and rounds 4. I think you could get a legitimate starting caliber edge, a guy who can give you real quality snaps in 2023, but then be a full-time starter in 2024 and beyond. I think you can get that guy in rounds 1 at 27 and in round 2 at 59. There is depth, again, like I said, in rounds 3 and round 4. There is good quality in this edge grouping from rounds 1 through 4. But as you go into 3 and 4, it is more of just those depth guys, more of those rotational threes who could pop up to an edge 2 if there's an injury or based on situation, who will give you some flashes. Again, I mentioned a bunch of those names. Defensive tackle and edge, there's a lot of quality in this grouping on day 2. There's a lot of really good defensive line value at edge and defensive tackle in rounds 2 and rounds 3. There's more first round talent at edge than there is defensive tackle. And I think it's a deeper edge class than it is a defensive tackle class. But there's really good value in the defensive line here in rounds 2 and rounds 3, which is also part of why I want to also go linebacker in the first round, even though I don't want to go linebacker in the first round. But again, the drop off from the linebackers you can get at 27 to the linebackers you can get later is much more significant than the defensive tackles or edges you could get at 27 versus the defensive tackles or edges that you could get later. And again, that's that positional drop off, those talent cliffs. That's the cost benefit analysis, right? Okay, if we take this player for this position here, what does it mean for addressing one of these other positions later? And I think the drop off at linebacker is much more significant. And so that's why I want to go with that earlier, because you can still get good value at defensive tackle and or edge in rounds 2 and rounds 3, potentially into round 4, depending on how the board falls. Same thing for wide receiver as well. That's my crux of all of this, right? Like it's weighing all those options. It's not just in a vacuum of like, sometimes it is, but it's not just the vacuum of like, who's the best player? Let's take him right here. It's who do we miss out on if we take this player? And if we have to address other positional needs, what are we missing out on all those other positions if we don't address that position now? You have to play that game. Bills are electric saying we don't need a linebacker from that draft that bad. The linebacker position is super important in this Bills defense in terms of what it does. And last year's team was different, but look what the Bills defense was without Tremaine Edmunds when he went down against the Minnesota Vikings, when that game turned. Also, I believe in the game against the Detroit Lions that he missed as well. When you saw Terrell Dodson in there for the Bills, or just, I don't want to single out Dodson, when Tremaine Edmunds was not in there, it was a significant drop for the Bills defense. There's a reason why the Bills interior defense from a pass defense standpoint was so good in DVOA these last several years, why they didn't really allow anything in the middle of the field and the intermediate and the deep. Some of that's Hyde and Poyer. A lot of it is Tremaine Edmunds. I know he wasn't the biggest splash guy or flash guy, but as a deterrent, he did a lot in the middle of that defense. And I think just watch how this defense performed in terms of what they called and what they weren't able to call and what they weren't able to execute when Tremaine Edmunds wasn't in there. Now, if you don't want to bring someone to mitigate the loss of Tremaine Edmunds, I think you have to have a schematic shift from a coverage standpoint and a front standpoint, because you cannot play the same defense you've been playing from a coverage standpoint, where you're asking your middle linebacker to drop in the middle third in a Tampa 2, or if you're playing quarters, to have him be that wall defender, or to have him be that guy that will carry a slot receiver or a tight end up the field based on match coverage. You cannot do that with the linebackers you currently have. You can't do that. And you can't do that with a lot of the linebackers in this class. So you don't have to take a linebacker early, but that means you have to then course correct and adjust the defense accordingly. And then it becomes, okay, is the juice worth the squeeze? If we don't address linebacker and we go, receiver or edge or defensive tackle or running back, whatever, if we go any other position but linebacker, how much better does it makes this team versus the hole that we still have at linebacker? Because that's what it is. Terrell Dodson cannot fill Tremaine Edmunds' shoes. Maybe Terrell Bernard can mitigate a little bit, but I think that's a large ask for him. And if you just need a reminder, look at that Minnesota game is a perfect example. I think that's not talked about enough. Like, that Minnesota game is talked about, Cam Lewis doesn't knock the ball down. Josh Allen fumbles on the goal line, the interception in overtime. But a big storyline in that game was Tremaine Edmonds went down, and all of a sudden the defense was super vulnerable in the middle against the run and against the pass. Like, he was making plays left and right on tape in that game. I actually broke down a bunch of the plays, like him just clamping down on Adam Thielen and closing things down in the middle of the field on TJ Hawkinson, both vertically and underneath. So you don't necessarily need a linebacker if you're going to schematically shift or change the defense. But and even if you stay aggressive or go aggressive and you do more of what Sean McDermott did in Carolina, you still want to be able to play match coverage. You still want to be able to, play some Tampa 2. You still want to be able to play quarters and match receivers or tight ends going on drags or overs or digs or posts and all these things. So, I do think they need somebody in that spot, and that somebody isn't necessarily on the roster right now. And if it is somebody on the roster right now, it means larger changes for the defense, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just requires more moving and shaking and more variables. And that worries me, right? If you have to, move heaven and earth to mitigate, or hide the deficiency you have at this one position, that comes into the cost benefit analysis piece. But it is what it is. Oh, what's up, Richard? Richard says, evening, Ann. Always good to see you, man. I appreciate you, Richard. Thank you for stopping by. So, again, really good defensive tackle and edge class from a middle of day 2 perspective, rounds 2 and rounds 3. Edge grouping, good as a whole from rounds 1 through 4, and especially in round 1. A lot of top-tier quality edge talent in this class, and then good value in rounds 2 and 3. Defensive tackle class, some names that could pop in to the end of round 1. But the main round 1 guys are going to be the Jalen Carters, the Brian Brzee, maybe Kalijah Cansey. He's another outlier in terms of size, but his tape is tremendous with how technically sound he is and how quick and bursty and twitchy he is. But a lot of the defensive tackle value is tied to rounds 2 and rounds 3. Let's bring up another position, offensive tackle. Another one that I have pounded the board for, in round 1 this entire offseason, mainly because I love Darnell Wright and what he could potentially bring. This offensive tackle group is a good group if you're looking at it from a rounds 1 through 3 perspective, and even into early 4, again, depending on how the board falls. With the offensive tackles in this class, you've got a combination of immediate starters and guys who can compete for starting spots in year 1 or potentially win jobs, which is very good for the Buffalo Bills, considering, one, they could use an upgrade for Spencer Brown, or at the very, very, very least, even if you believe in Spencer Brown and think that year 3 will be his breakout year and he'll turn it around, and if he stays healthy, he'll hit his ceiling or get closer to it, so on and so forth. Even if that's your take, that's fine. You could still use depth to the tackle group, because right now your tackle group is Deion Dawkins, Spencer Brown, Tommy Doyle, and David Quessenberry. And I like David Quessenberry. I like his story. I like his veteran presence. I just see him getting burned by Bryce Huff against the Jets, and Bryce Huff hurting Josh Allen's elbow every time I think of David Quessenberry. So you could use youth, and you could use some long-term contract sustainability and viability in the tackle group. So I think tackle is a target in this class, but what's good about this offensive tackle class is, again, some of the depth and what you can get in rounds 1 through 3 and even potentially into early round 4. I think round 1, you legitimately could see 4 to 6 tackles go. That's where you're looking at your Paris Johnsons, your Broderick Joneses, Darnell Wright, maybe Anton Harrison creeps up in there, DeJuan Jones. Matthew Bergeron is a guy who I initially really liked at 59 and in the second round. Now there's talk that he is going to be propelled up a little bit into the early second, maybe even late first. If you watched the episode last week with Joe Marino, we talked about the potential of Matthew Bergeron being a first round pick. So you're looking at about 4 to 6 guys at the offensive tackle spot that could go in the first round, anywhere from literally from pick 1 all the way to 31. Again, there's not 32 because the Dolphins got penalized. They lost their first round pick. Boo-hoo, too bad, so sad. But you look into where the value is in rounds 3 and rounds 4. And I like that value. I like Tyler Steen from Alabama, even though maybe he kicks into guard with his skill set and his size and his frame. You've got Nick Saldiveri. You've got Carter Warren. You've got Braden Daniels. You've got Blake Freeland, who I don't love, but he's really intriguing from a size and athleticism standpoint. You've got Asim Richards from North Carolina, Wanya Morris from Oklahoma. There is value in day 2 picks at offensive tackle for the Buffalo Bills, which is also part of the reason I'm not too distraught at the idea of the Bills not going offensive tackle early. because I do think they can get somebody to compete with Spencer Brown. Now, if you're not getting a round one tackle, the odds of Spencer Brown potentially beating that person out go up. If you're taking a tackle on round 2 or round 3 or round 4, then I think it becomes more of a legitimate competition with Spencer Brown. And if your new guy wins, cool. If not, you have a rookie who is now under term for the next 4 years if you take him after round 1. And now you've got depth, you've got youth, and you've got somebody you can develop in your system for the next couple of years. And you help yourself from a depth perspective, from a functional depth perspective. But again, if you go early, if you go with Darnell Wright, I think I think Darnell Wright becomes the starter. I think he beats out Spencer Brown. Anton Harrison, maybe it's more of a battle. Matthew Bergeron, he's also really athletic, but he needs to clean up some technicality pieces. DeJuan Jones, I really like, not as much as some other people. I do think there are some questions about, about him from a size perspective in terms of how he can consistently anchor and his susceptibility to inside moves. But again, this isn't crazy. You take a guy earlier, I think the odds are if you take an offensive tackle in round 1, I think the Bills are looking to replace Spencer Brown. If you take one in rounds 3 or rounds 4, then it's looking like a competition, and you're going to get some depth as your worst case scenario. But again, the good news is, and as Richard says right here, we've got to do something about this line. The good news is, again, there is depth at offensive tackle in rounds 1 through 3 and into early round 4, depending on how the board falls. So I think you can get a legitimate plug and play right tackle starter over Spencer Brown in round 1, potentially round 2, depending on how the board falls. But worst case scenario, I think you can get a tackle in round 3 or round 4, and then you're creating competition and you're getting depth. So maybe that guy beats out Spencer Brown, maybe he doesn't, and then you have good depth. Either way, I think you can reinforce the tackle position in this draft without having to go round 1. So, that's a good piece for a need for the Buffalo Bills at offensive tackle. This is a decently strong class in rounds 1 through 3. Some random notes and pieces. It's super annoying that the Bills don't need a corner this year because corner is probably the best group in this entire draft. It's super deep and it is very strong at the top. And it's super annoying that the Bills don't need a corner because there's a ton of really good corners that are probably going to be available at 27. There's good corners throughout this entire draft. It's really stacked rounds 1 through 3. So again, it's a real shame and kind of annoying that they don't need a corner. Tight end is also very interesting. It's been talked about a little bit on this show. I think there's good depth at the top from like a top tier perspective with the Kincaids and the Mayers. I really like Sam Laporta. But then even on the back end, some of the guys with Zach Kuntz from Old Dominion, who I like. I know Schoonmaker has been a popular one for Bills fans, a tight end from Michigan. Like, there's good value in rounds 1, 2, 3, and even in round 4, maybe even 5, depending on where Kuntz lands. Again, more developmental, obviously, as you go farther along. But tight end has good value. I think the Bills could do themselves a favor there and address that position. I like Quentin Morris, but you could potentially upgrade from him, or at the very least give him some competition and reinforce that tight end position a little bit more for you. Offensive guard has some viability, as does center. I just don't know what they do there, given the McGovern signing, given the David Edwards signing. Do they invest early on in center or guard, given what they've done on the interior of the line in free agency? But there are good centers and good interior linemen. You've got Joe Tippmann and Luke Whippler at center. A center who I really like that's late, Alex Forsyth from Oregon, put out a bunch of his tape about a month ago. He's someone I think you could get on day 3 to back up Mitch Morse. Or again, maybe you do go guard because your backup center plan is Ryan Bates. And then there's guard options for this team as well, depending on, again, what you're looking for and where you're looking to get it. I don't think they're going to go guard early. I don't think you're looking at the Steve Avilas of the world, or I don't view Skoronski as a guard. I know some people do. I don't view him as that. I just don't see them taking, Torrance or Avila or Cody Mock. I think more of the guys later. City So is one who Eric and I talked about. Well, we'll be talking about tomorrow on the episode of the Film Room. and you'll find out why. I really liked Andrew Voorhees, the guard from USC, a lot. He tore his ACL during the combine. I wouldn't mind taking a flyer on him on day 3 and just sitting him and storing him. Granted, he is a little older, and then you kind of muddy the waters further with this ACL injury, but I really, really, really like him, so I kind of don't care. I do like Antonio Mafi, people mover, physical from UCLA. I think he could be got in later rounds. I don't really see them addressing guard in this draft. Guard isn't a tremendously deep or great class, so you'd have to invest earlier on. And I don't necessarily see that happening for the Bills in this draft, but who knows? You never know, potentially. You know what you do know? The best pizza in Buffalo, New York, hands down, One Pie Pizza. See the logo. I always get this wrong. In the bottom, it's so stupid. Bottom, my left, your right-hand corner, you see the One Pie Pizza logo. You can find their online menu in the episode show notes, whether here on YouTube or any one of the podcasting apps or platforms. Go check their online menu out. Get yourself a delicious sweet sauce pie. Get yourself some delicious cup and char pepperoni, some homemade blue cheese. Again, the online menu can be found in the episode show notes, whether here on YouTube or any one of the podcasting apps or platforms. Go to get yourself some One Pie Pizza. Tell them Disguise Coverage sent you. It is legitimately the best pizza, hands down, in Buffalo, New York. And they do a ton of drives and initiatives to help the city of Buffalo and the community at large with their different partnerships with charities and different companies. So do some good for the community. Do some good for your taste buds. Get yourself some One Pie Pizza. Question here, or statement here from Anthony saying, I couldn't find last week's film room. We didn't do a film room last week. You will see a film room tomorrow, and then potentially no film room the week after. Film room schedule's gotten a little bit wonky, but you will have a film room dropping tomorrow. Eric and I are doing a mock draft, so you will see that tomorrow, breaking down different players, tiers, all these types of things. You will see that. Question here from Joey. Joey says, Andrew Voorhees a potential option. I feel like we're probably maybe done at guard, but with the injury he had, he might slip. I don't know if you're asking because you heard me talk about him just now or you just came in, but yeah, I mentioned him like 2 minutes ago. I don't know. So he's a bit of an older prospect already coming in. I mean, that's kind of tied to some of his benefit. He's very experienced. But then you add in that ACL injury. I don't know where he goes. I think he probably goes day 3 now. I just don't know where. I think round 5 is a good barometer, give or take a round. Maybe he falls to 6. Maybe he falls to 4. I don't think he's undraftable. I thought his tape was really good. I wanted him at guard. I would have used a 3rd round pick on Andrew Voorhees with what his tape was at USC. He was one of my favorite guys in this entire class with his experience. No worries, Joey. I appreciate you being here, so you don't have to apologize for getting here, but it's super funny because I literally mentioned him and then you came in and you're like, question about Andrew Voorhees. I'm gonna be like, are you messing with me? So yeah, no apology needed. I appreciate you being here. I like him a lot. I would have no problem throwing a 6th round pick at him or even a 5th. I know the injury muddies things. I just think with the type of person that he is and the skill set he has, granted, what's going to hurt him and ding him for some people is athleticism and movement wasn't his strong suit before. Now with the torn ACL, how much of a hindrance is that to his already somewhat limited mobility and lower body movement and agility? So that's going to be a huge wild card. But I liked his pre-injury tape so much. I would love to take him in the 6th round. I might be okay taking him in round 5. Really unfortunate that he got hurt. And then you also mentioned it too from a Bills perspective. Yeah, are they done? You know, you bring in McGovern, you bring in David Edwards. So now you're sitting there and you got McGovern, you got Bates, you got Edwards, you got Butker. You know, are they set at guard? Also tying into that too, like what is their backup center situation? Do they view Ryan Bates as the backup center? So if that's the case and anything happens to Mitch Morse, Bates kicks into center, then you would potentially maybe need another guard for depth, or maybe you want someone with guard center flexibility or capability. So I wouldn't rule out the interior. I think center would be more likely to be drafted than guard would, but I wouldn't rule out any position given, you know, being in company's ability to just kind of just fly by the seat of their pants at sometimes and like certain players and like value and go with it. And then someone like Voorhees, if you speak to Andrew Voorhees, you're going to fall in love with him if you're a team. And then you watch the tape, you're going to fall in love with that too. The biggest question that I don't know the answer to is how significant that knee injury is in terms of hindering his future performance. And I don't think anybody knows that. But I think he will slip to day 3. Before I had him as a day 2 pick. Now I think he slips to day 3. I think round 5 is probably a safe bet. Good question, though. And I like talking about Andrew Voorhees. I'm going to throw up the banner now. Oh, actually, I like this comment here from Richard. Richard says, yourself and Eric always do a fantastic job in the film room. I appreciate you, Richard. You're going to get a lot more film as we go forward here in Disguise coverage as well, because I'll be breaking down a bunch of film. I'm a film guy. I grind tape. I'm big into advanced metrics and film and merging the two together. But film is my bread and butter. I think that's how you study X's and O's and scheme. I also think film is how you properly evaluate prospects. So I think you have to grind the tape in terms of, being able to do what I do or do what this brand was founded upon. So it's tremendously important. So thank you for recognizing the contributions we have in the film room. Put up the banner that says toodles, folks. Before we fully go, I know people will start to wind down and wind out here, but please, 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 and thank you. If you haven't already, please drop a like on this video. It goes a long way towards helping myself and the entire team to track and trend in front of more eyes and ears. So please, 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 and thank you. Drop a like on this video if you haven't already. That is, of course, if you enjoyed this content. So if you did, drop a like on this video. If you didn't enjoy this content, I don't know what to tell you, but I appreciate you being here. I want to thank everyone who rode with me live here on this episode. I know it's kind of the weird, doldrums of April before the draft really kicks in. There's no official news dropping, and it's kind of slow, and everybody kind of maybe takes a back seat from content until they really ramp up for the draft at the end of the month. So thank you to everyone who joined me live on this episode. I appreciate the hell out of you folks, especially when I ride solo on these episodes without a guest. It can be very lonesome. If there's not, a bunch of people joining me live and seeing the chat going up and moving all the time. So thank you very much to everyone who rode with me live. Thank you for your questions for me, your conversation with one another, the engagement back and forth, the kind words, the likes, anything and everything. Thank you very much for being here. If you didn't if you didn't join me live here on this episode and you were watching post live here on YouTube or listening on any one of the podcasting apps or platforms, that's appreciated too. Thank you very much for whatever way you view or listen or download or consume Disguise coverage. It's greatly appreciated in any way, shape, or form. If you are listening on one of the podcasting apps or platforms like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave a rating and or a review. Genuine feedback is always appreciated, positive or negative, whatever you got, but leave a rating and review. Those are extremely helpful. Please subscribe to Disguise coverage on the podcasting apps or platforms. We had a bit of a snafu from a brand perspective with the URL and the audio links and how it connected to the channel on the podcasting app side of things. So like Spotify and Google. So if you need to go back and reattach those or resubscribe, please, 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 and do that. Please do that. I'm falling apart here for Disguise coverage. And again, if you're here on YouTube, please drop a like on this video. Please, 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 and thank you. It goes a long way. So I appreciate your likes, your ratings, your reviews. Please subscribe to Disguise coverage here on YouTube or whichever podcasting app or platform you are listening to this show on. Tell your family and friends and loved ones about how awesome this show is. And if you thought the show was terrible, tell your enemies and try and ruin their day with this show. I appreciate all the kind words that are coming through for you folks or from you folks for me. Wow, I'm really stumbling over myself here. I'm tired. It's been a long day. Plus my back is killing me, but that's a conversation for another time. I really appreciate all the kind words that are coming through for myself from the chat from you folks. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Like Sophia said earlier in this show, 2 weeks and 2 days until the NFL draft. Very exciting times for everyone. I'm speaking for myself. I love the draft. It's like Christmas time. It is almost draft miss. So I hope you folks are just as excited too. Join me next week live Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern for another episode of Disguise coverage. We're going to be breaking down some more important things and some more draft specific things for the Buffalo Bills. I like that comment from Sal that says the blueberries count is correct as usual. Appreciate the hell out of it. Well done, Sal. I like that. So yeah, more draft content, more Bill specific content as we go forward here live every Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern here on Disguise coverage. But until next week, this has been it for another episode of Disguise coverage. I hope you and your family and friends and loved ones are all doing well, staying safe, be kind to one another, take care of one another. I will see you all next week live, 9 p.m. Eastern for another episode of Disguise coverage. But until then, Godspeed. I appreciate you all more than you will ever know. Please drop a like on this video. And this is funny from Ralph. Carrying the show will give you backaches. Nice job. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. My back is legitimately killing me. I'm probably going to go lay down and put my knees up because my back is on fire. But I appreciate you folks. I will see you next week. Godspeed. And as always,